Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist, and I'm based in private practice in 10 Harley Street. And welcome to all the listeners, and particularly the new listeners who may not be aware. I am actually a proper doctor. Hard to believe, I know. And as I said before, I work in private practice in Harley Street, London. We are in the presence of greatness today because this is a very special person I've been wanting to get on the program for a while. His name is Dr. Cosmo Duff-gordon, and he has founded a very famous, well-known, well-regarded clinic in London, specializing, and he'll tell us a bit more about it, in addictions called Start to Stop. But he also has a very distinguished ancestor. So, Cosmo, let me start by asking you, because you have a fantastic name, tell us a bit about your ancestor, because there's a link with the Titanic. Tell us a bit about that.
Raj, yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on your show. Yes, you're referring to someone called Cosmo Duff-gordon, who was my great uncle, who was my great grandfather's older brother, and he was indeed on the Titanic, and he made the mistake really of surviving, and he went down really badly, and he was kind of vilified at the time in the press, and he achieved, sadly for him, actually, probably fair to say, quite a degree of infamy. And he died, I think, in 1931 or 32. I think the Titanic sank in April 1912. And so he regularly gets mentioned. Articles in the Titanic often will reference him. And I mean, I've written over the years a couple of articles actually for the Sunday Times about. Yeah, I have. Yeah, well, the South African Sunday Times about it. I mean, it's an interesting story, but in a nutshell, he was a well-known character in Edwardian England. He'd won an Olympic silver medal for fencing. He had a title. He was a baronet. He was married to a very famous fashion designer called Lucille, who was one of the original It girls with her sister Eleanor, and they traveled first class, and they got off on the number one lifeboat, which I think was designed for about 50 people. It was them and her maid, a few other first class passengers, and then some stokers who did the rowing. And so, it didn't go down well. But the sub story there really was that William Randolph Hearst in America, he sold millions of newspapers because off the back of creating a storyline around Cosmo Duff-gordon being a kind of cad. There were sort of imputations that he dressed as a woman to get onto the lifeboat, which was patently ridiculous. He was 6'3" with a moustache. I mean, I think I'd like to think people might have noticed that. But there you go. So it sold newspapers, but I think his name's been cleared subsequently through letters, that over the years have come out and been sold at auction. But what I will say is that the Spectator some years back published a list of the top 10 cads of the 20th century, and I think he came in at number 1.
Wow, Cosmo! Yeah. What a history to have the same name. That's the number 1 cad and bounder of the 20th century.
Yes,
we're gonna discuss the psychological impact on you, and you are an eminent psychologist, in a moment. But I just want to run over the story. I know it's painful, but I think it's so fascinating. He got into the number 1 lifeboat, and it had massive capacity for many more people than were actually ended up in the boat. And the theory is that he dissuaded or got them to unload the boat fast, and also he bribed the people on the boat, the sailors, not to take any other passengers. That's the story. I mean, obviously, you're going to correct me. And that he also got in the boat when it's only women and children first. And he was in the boat when it was only meant to be women and children in there. Hence the made up story that he dressed as a woman. Anyway, so that's kind of why he's a cad and a bounder, isn't he? He was in first class, and bribery is involved, and he's in the boat when it should be just women and children, and he's also bribing the sailors not to get other people in the boat. Is that kind of, roughly speaking, the cad and bounder thing in a nutshell?
That, in a nutshell, I think that's the William Randolph Hearst newspaper storyline. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The truth, I think he was actually the only passenger who was cross-questioned at the inquest.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. there was a guy called Lord Mersey who ran the inquest, and I think he gave poor old Cosmo quite a hard time. I think he was indeed the only passenger actually cross-questioned. And so, okay, on the one hand, you know, the newspaper thing was that he'd sort of bribed the stokers to sort of let him on. His narrative was that, and not many people know this, is that back in those days, from the moment a ship sank beneath the waves, all pay stopped. Okay, so if you were a stoker or a sailor or a merchant sailor on one of those ships, your pay stopped from the second the ship sank, disappeared under the waves. So when they were rescued by the Carpathia, Cosmo got out his checkbook and he wrote a check for £5 to each of the stokers, which I don't know what that would be in modern terms, maybe £500 each as a tip, basically. And also because I think he felt sorry for them because they'd lost all their possessions, which are also uninsured. So that was his narrative. In terms of turning back to rescue the because you probably know this, but most of the people who drowned from the Titanic, they were just bobbing around in the sea. They died of hypothermia, and I don't think a single lifeboat went back. I think around 30 lifeboats made it out, approximately, and not one. I believe not one of them went back to pick up survivors. But that is true. They were very fearful of being swamped. And so, and then the third point about being on a boat for women and children, that does seem like a fair point. Again, Cosmo's narrative was that he was encouraged to get on the boat because apparently there was lots of space. It's not true that boat was full. Ironically, that boat had capacity for 50 people, and I think it only had about 23 people on it, including the stokers who were doing the rowing. So it had lots of capacity. And so his narrative was that he was encouraged to get on. So, you know, but I agree. It does seem, you know, certainly unusual that, you know, a first class passenger male didn't go down with the ship. And, you know, if you look at his visitors book, what you see is that it was very, you know, he had a very busy social life until the sinking of the Titanic. But thereafter, I think he was quite socially ostracized, and you know, he had a place in Scotland, and he sort of, I think, lived quite quietly up there. But anyway, the scandal, the reverberations of that night, you know, continue for sure.
Absolutely, because the Titanic is one of those stories that just never seems to go away. It keeps coming back. There's something psychologically interesting, isn't there, about the fact it never dies, and more films get made and the exhibitions and so on. You look a bit pained by the fact it never seems to die.
I was actually thinking, I was a bit pained because I took my children to the there was a sort of Titanic exhibition at like Canada Water earlier in the year.
That's right, the O2 Centre, yeah.
Yeah, somewhere around there, yeah. And I took my children to it, and it was quite a pained look. I was remembering getting into the queues. That's hence the pained look.
Did they mention your ancestor? Did they in the exhibition? Cosmo Duff-gordon, the original one?
He actually didn't get a mention there. But in the main Titanic exhibition in Belfast, he does have, he has a sort of corner.
Oh my God!
I haven't visited it, but apparently there's a Cosmo Duff-gordon corner.
Okay, so I've obviously got to ask you, as a psychiatrist and you're a psychologist, first of all, I'm interested in the fact you went out of your way to try and rescue his reputation a bit. I find that interesting. What was that about? What's going on there?
I'm not sure I have necessarily
You tried to rescue it. You tried to rescue. And we try to rescue people, don't we, Cosmo?
That's well, I suppose we do. I think the thing is that reputationally, I've never really bought the sort of press narrative about the Titanic. So but I mean, I'm aware all my life, actually, people have always gone, oh my God, you know, you related to the guy from the Titanic, and, you know, he dress as a woman. And I'm like, don't be ridiculous. He was 6'3" and he had moustaches, you know, and so on. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, funnily enough, I mean, you've clearly done your research, Raj. There's another ancestor, another Cosmo called Cosmo Gordon. He fought the last duel. He was accused of cowardice during the American War of Independence, 1770s, and he fought the last duel in Hyde Park illegally.
Wow!
And killed his opponent, and then fled to Paris, but then got pardoned by George III. So the Cosmos in the family have got a history, and my history's been fairly spotty too, although hopefully in more recent years, rather better.
You'll know there's a large part of psychology that believes in what we might call, the past being very, very important. There's a Freudian idea about childhood and so on. Do you believe the past is important? Because the current vogue is it's the here and now. We won't discuss the past. And today, patients are even surprised now because of the current vogue with the thing called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's all about being in the present. And how come your current thoughts lead to you being angry? Do you think we've abandoned the idea of the past being important in psychology and psychiatry in a way that's now unhelpful? Because it's kind of like very unfashionable, isn't it? But I don't know whether you'd agree with that analysis.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, my own training as a therapist and as a psychologist is very much around formulation. So, in other words, trying to think about your client and think about how and formulate them in the sense of thinking about how the past has informed the present. And I mean, certainly when it comes to addictions treatment, which is, as you know, my specialization, the past, not 100% of the time, but for many people, early childhood experiences are incredibly important. And really the addiction problems you might see are, in a way, they're problems in and of themselves, but they're also, for many, symptomatic of a more primary underlying problem stemming from childhood or from development. So I think, to answer the question, I think it depends on one's training and perhaps also how much space you've got to work with clients. I think certainly in the private sector, which is where I am, there's usually much more space to work with a client for much longer. And I think, certainly my peer group, who I trained with, many of those who work in the NHS are, they're delivering CBT, but often very time limited, only maybe 6 to 10 sessions of CBT. And then there's not really the time to formulate the client and start working through the underlying stuff. But I think, trauma and trauma reduction, certainly in terms of addictions treatment, very important elements of the work, that gets done. And that would be the case really around the world.
So just before we leave the past, your very notorious ancestor, Cosmo Duff-gordon, your parents gave you the name Cosmo, and they could have given you another name. So what was going on there? Because it was in a way, they saddled you with his legacy to some extent, didn't they? I mean, and therefore you were tied forever as a result of that story.
Well, to be fair, well, I think what was going on is Cosmo's been a family name for about 300 years. So,
okay,
many generations. What it was, there was an ancestor who did the Grand Tour, and he from Scotland, and he became good friends with one of the Cosimo de' Medici in Florence.
Okay.
And when he went home to Scotland, he had a son, and he christened the son Cosmo as an anglicization of Cosimo, and Medici was his godfather. So it's been in the Gordon family. Cosmo's actually, although it's an unusual first name, it's quite a common first name in the Gordon family.
Well, if he was friends with the de Medicis, was that in the 16th, 15th century Florence, the time that Machiavelli was around? Because they were like the mafioso. They were the local mafioso, weren't they? The Medicis.
I think the Gordon in question, I think he that was around 1700, 1710.
Okay, right.
But I think Medici was still in power in Florence.
But if I remember correctly, at the time Machiavelli was writing, which is around 1500, I think, people are going to correct me, I'm sure. If you crossed the Medicis, what was found, you were found in the market square the next morning, but quartered. One part of your body was in one corner, the other was in another, etc., etc. So they kind of like sent a message that you don't mess with them.
You're sleeping with the fishes, yeah. So I think the Borgia were probably the family really to not mess.
Okay. I may have confused it with them. The Medicis may have been just the wealthy bankers, but I mean, they were very, very wealthy.
I think they were all pretty ruthless. I think to retain
I see. Okay.
Days, I suspect you had to be pretty ruthless.
Okay. So let's talk a bit about your background and training then. So you ended up training in psychology, and I think you've got a PhD in psychology. What attracted you to psychology in the first place? How did you get drawn to the subject?
Well, I had my own addiction problems, and I got into recovery in 2004, and I went through a South African rehab system. And that was formative for me in the sense that I did a 7-month rehab process, stepping down across that 7 months, but it was nonetheless a 7-month process. So I initially trained as a counsellor in South Africa, and then I think I was always drawn to psychology because it's just so interesting, different ways of thinking about the world and about people and about oneself. And so I started doing that through the Open University while working in Cape Town. I have to say the Open University, I think, is the most brilliant thing because it allows you, to do an undergraduate degree, in my case, whilst working. And then I moved back to London with my family in 2010 and completed the undergrad psychology and was keen really to do a doctorate in psychology, I think for a lot of reasons, but I think especially just to continue, that sort of path of professional development. And I think especially when it comes to addiction as well, addiction sits at the intersection of many, many mental health disorders. And so, it made a lot of sense, I think, for me to study psychology and therefore open myself up to, many, many different models and ways of thinking about addiction and about mental health.
So I hope you don't mind me being a bit cheeky and asking you. You said you got into it because you had your own addiction problems. Could you say something about that, if I'm allowed to ask you?
Yeah, no, sure.
Down if I'm not.
No, you're very allowed. I've given interviews about it in the past in the press. I had quite a long-term heroin addiction, and I did some rehab actually in the mid-90s, but I sort of wasn't ready, as they say. But by sort of 2003, 2004, I was, and so I in fact, I went to see my uncle, who's another addictions counsellor. I remember quite well in January 2004, and he sort of said, look, why don't you go to South Africa and do some treatment there? And I remember saying, well, why would I go to South Africa? And he was saying, look, take your swimming trunks, take some golf clubs, take a suit, get a suntan, swim, eat some good food, and we'll see you in a few months. And I remember thinking, well, why wouldn't I do that? And it was such a brilliant sell of treatment. In fact, I've used that sort of sell a few times myself with sort of slightly reluctant clients at assessment. But I was sort of ready. So basically, I just had a long-term addiction and I wasn't happy. And I knew, I wanted to stop. What it was with me was I wanted to stop, but I didn't know how. It was how do I stop? And also, I couldn't conceive really of a life without drugs. It was unimaginable.
Again, am I allowed to ask you, how did you get into heroin in the first place?
Yeah, I got into it at university. I went to Edinburgh and I did a 4-year MA. I think this was in the late 80s, and I think it certainly wasn't ubiquitous, but it was around, it was fairly common, and quite a few of my friends were doing it, and in the end, I decided to try it, and found myself really liking it. And of course, also importantly, I don't think anyone plans to become addicted. So you always tell yourself, or I told myself, I'll just try, it's very nice. I'll do it now and again, I won't be addicted. But of course, I did become addicted.
Do you think there's a theory that different kinds of people get addicted to different kinds of drugs, that the personality type of the people who don't necessarily get addicted, but fancy MDMA or LSD or the hallucinogenic drugs are different to the kind of people who favor heroin, who are different from the kind of people who favor cocaine? Do you subscribe to that idea?
Yeah, I think I probably do subscribe to that as a generalization. I think that's true. I think people who like heroin, which is obviously depressant, would probably also quite like Valium, would probably also quite like alcohol, and probably also quite like cannabis. And I think in my experience, the energy of people who are addicted to depressants is quite different to the energy of people who are into stimulants like Coke. And I mean, there's a guy, you'd be familiar with Edward Kantian from Harvard. His models since the 80s really of addiction would be that, the drug of choice of any given person with an addiction problem is chosen unconsciously because it's really a self-medication of an internal terrain, which is shaped by childhood experiences. And that's why people get drawn to particular drugs of choice. So I think it is true. Yeah, I think different there's a different energy attached.
So tell us a bit about that theory in a little bit more detail. What kind of childhood landscape terrain thing is going on for, let's say, for someone who chooses heroin? What treatment or fix is it meant to be fixing on the inside? I know it's a gross generalization, but give us some sense of what the theory is there.
Well, I think it would probably be that. Well, Kantian's model would be the reason heroin is selected is because heroin probably has the requisite sort of analgesic effect on internal psychic pain. You know, I mean, I would say most people with heroin addictions, probably true across most addictions, but probably, you know, stuff happened when they're little, probably abandonment issues, probably quite sensitive, quite intelligent. And there is a sort of, in the end, the relationship with the drug replaces relationships with other people, you know. And I suppose the payoff is that addiction provides pleasure in the absence of others, and actually it becomes a self-sustaining ecosystem. You know, you don't really need other people. So I think you're probably going to find it's people who've been quite hurt when they were little.
Okay, so let's go with that. So you're the therapist, and you run this famous clinic. Tell us a bit about how you would work with someone with that kind of terrain. How do you go about treating them?
Okay, well, okay. So how would we do it? I suppose.
The first question I'm going to ask you is: addicts are often very irritating people to most therapists. I think people who are not skilled like you. So your very description of why a person might choose heroin already would be a bit irritating to anyone meeting them.
Is that right?
So,
I mean,
I think so. How do you seem to be naturally sympathetic, maybe because of your training and your background. But the first point I'd like to make is, how does one get past the irritation that, generally speaking, many people feel towards an addict? Because it feels very self-indulgent. As a bit different to depression. You know, you lose your job, you get depressed. There's a sense in which it's not entirely, you know, it happened to you. Addiction sounds a lot more like a self-inflicted problem. But what's interesting about the way you phrased
it's
made
interesting.
it sound.
No, but I mean, there's lots of ways of thinking about addiction. Addiction is very
Yes.
poorly understood for sure. But
Sure,
but that's the sort of societal discourse that it's a sort of failure of self-control.
Yes.
And it's like, just drink less, or don't take cocaine, or just don't do heroin, or, you know, but the problem with addiction is beyond rationality. And I think subjectively, the experience of addiction, if you're an addict, is of being almost hijacked from within, because you're in the grip of compulsion. In other words, you're doing things despite knowing you shouldn't be doing them and probably not wanting to do them. So I think what helps with the irritation is probably understanding addiction as essentially beyond a person's control or choice. In other words, it's not a control problem, because if control was the problem, the solution would be train a person in control.
Which a lot of people think is the solution.
I mean, a lot of people, that is a model, you know, for sure. I mean, another popular model would be the moral model, that addicts are just bad, you know, and in which case the solution would probably be, don't bother going to rehab, maybe go to church or go to the mosque or wherever, you know. I mean, it's interesting. The American legal system, the big test case was I don't know if you know, it's Traynor versus Turnage.
It rings a bell, but tell us a bit more for people listening who don't know about it.
Okay, so it's approximately 1984. There was an American basketball scholar I think it was at Atlanta State University. And in America, with scholarships, you have to keep performing to retain your scholarship. It's not like the English system where you're often just given a scholarship and that's it, no matter how badly or well you do. In America, you have to keep performing. And this guy was drinking incredibly heavily. In fact, he was an alcoholic, and he stopped making practice. His performance declined, and before long, he was dropped from the squad. And then the university took back the scholarship. They said, "You're no longer justifying the scholarship. We're taking it back." So he sued them, and he said, "This is monstrously unfair. You're discriminating against me because I have this illness called alcoholism. If I had cancer, I'd have kept the scholarship. I happen to have alcoholism, and you're taking it away." So it went all the way to the US Supreme Court. So it's a famous ruling, Traynor versus Turnage, I think 84. And the US Supreme Court, believe it or not, defined alcoholism as, quote, willful misconduct. Okay, and that's the discourse you're in, Raj. It's of sort of there's it can be control can be applied, willpower can be applied, Whereas I suppose my understanding of addiction is that addicts are not bad, and nor are they lacking in control. It's beyond those things. It's very hard to understand illness, but it does involve essentially being hijacked from within and being in the grip of compulsion. So going back to how do you treat the heroin addict, I suppose stage one always would be ideally quite long-term extended primary treatment, where you're detoxed. As you know, with detox from heroin, you have post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which can last for a while, another several weeks, insomnia, possibly feeling very low mood, feeling dysphoria, lack of pleasure in life. And then once you've completed primary treatment and you're now detoxed, you're mentally okay, reasonably stable, your sleep is okay, your appetite's okay. Then at that point, for me, and I specialize in this, I would say go and do secondary treatment. So be removed from the world, removed from the community, from medically supervised detox and first stage treatment, but then come back into the world for residential secondary care for probably three or so months. And the object of secondary care, it's about supporting people while they build lives in recovery in London. In my case, because I'm based in London, but it could be in New York, it could be in Edinburgh, it could be anywhere. Because I think the mistake a lot of people make with addictions treatment is they go away for primary treatment and then they just go home, and there's some vague, advice perhaps to sort of go to some AA meetings or see your nice psychiatrist or see your nice therapist. But I think it's incredibly difficult to do that. The relapse rate's very, very high. If all you do is primary treatment and go home, then it's going to be tough. And of course, people don't relapse in primary treatment in some very safe environment, which is micromanaged, where there are no drink or drugs available. People relapse when they go home. So for me, it's all about a long-term continuum of care. So that client, and again, it also depends how intact a person's life is before they go into treatment. I mean, some people are quite high functioning in addiction, in a sort of slightly unmanageable way or very unmanageable way, nonetheless hold together marriages and careers and jobs and their health. Others, it's all bombed out, it's in ruins, it's a disaster. So that it's all about the rebuild, and the extent to which there needs to be a rebuild, I think, dictates how much scaffolding a person needs to support them as they do that, and how long scaffolding needs to be there. But for me, philosophically, long-term continuums of care equals good outcomes when it comes to addictions treatment.
Let's go back to the detox, because again, a lot of people listening won't quite know what you mean by that. So there's a lot of controversy around this. The film Trainspotting, for example, seems to pour a bit of cold water over the whole detox idea, because what the parents do there is they basically rather brutally lock up the kid who's got the addiction, and he then goes through a very vivid series of experiences to do with going cold turkey and comes out the other end. So there's a kind of message there, which is forget the professionals keep giving you other drugs to detox you. They're just giving you other drugs, right? But the theory with detox, and again, you are more of an expert than me, is that people are withdrawing. During the withdrawal stage, not only is it medically dangerous, but they're going to develop very strong cravings to go and get the drug. And if you give them other drugs, not heroin, but other drugs that deal with some of these symptoms, they will pass through the withdrawal phase relatively, medically at least, unscathed. But tell us your version of what that looks like, or what are your thoughts about that?
No, I think you captured it in a nutshell. I mean, I'm trying to remember was it Renton in Trainspotting himself?
Could be. I'm not sure. Can't remember. But anyway, it was a pretty horrific scene. But very interesting, because really what happened, I think, and it is a very interesting debate and message, is the parents took control. And the parents decided, we're fed up with the professionals. They're not really doing it. And there actually is a deep truth there, that sometimes, unless you've got a very good professional, professionals usually make things worse because they stop people thinking about their own resources to fix a problem. I think that's my own very controversial thing in psychiatry.
Maybe, but Renton relapsed. Renton didn't stay clean.
Yeah, I know. Oh, yeah. Good comeback, Cosmo.
Well, I mean, I mean, again, the problem with detox is one sees this treating alcoholism. As you know, you'll often see people who've done innumerable detoxes over the years for alcohol, 4 days here, 5 days there. And it's all a question, really. Again, it comes down really to your ontology of addiction. What do you think it's all about? What is your, so you take heroin addiction. If you think the problem is just a physical dependency on heroin, in other words, if you think the problem is I am using heroin every day because I have to, because if I don't take heroin, I'm going to be puking up, I'm going to be shivering, I'm going to have a fever, I can't function, therefore I'm physically dependent, so I have to take it. If you think that is simply the problem, then the solution of just do a detox, remove all heroin from your system, and then you're good to go. That makes sense. But the unfortunate problem for most is that the problem isn't just a physical dependency, because you have the psychological element, you have the cultural element, you have, because again, you know, one inhabits a culture of addiction as well. So it's kind of psychological, it's physical, it's emotional, it's friendship groups, it's cultural. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I personally do believe that if you have a heroin problem, I've seen very, very few in my career's been going on about 17 years. I have seen the odd person, but very odd person, manage a detox from heroin in the community. Very, very rare. You've got to be highly, highly motivated to do that. In my experience, most people, certainly with an opiate or opioid dependency, have to go somewhere for a managed inpatient detox, where, as you say, might be given something like buprenorphine, Subutex, a substitute, a more gentle substitute to take the edge off the cold turkey symptoms. Absolutely, yeah.
But the reason why this is controversial is that the theory is the addict is looking for a soft landing, not a crash landing, which is what terminating the drug of choice would be. And in their search for a cushion for the crash landing, they just basically keep looking for a cushion, and they're just replacing one cushion for another cushion. And they've not understood something, which is if you're going to come off drugs, there will be pain and suffering. Yes. So if you keep saying, as I see many people in my clinic say, I can't come off this drug because when I try stopping it, bad things begin to happen. I have to explain, well, I'm sorry, that's the problem here, is that you've got to understand, unless you're willing to tolerate bad things, we'll try to cushion the bad things the best we can. But unless you're open to the fact that bad things are going to happen, you can never come off the drug. And the other thing that then happens, I'm interested in your view, because again, you know more about this than me, they blame the drug, right, for why they can't come off. But actually it's them, it's their intolerance of the bad things that are going to happen. But again, am I being too brutal? What are your thoughts?
No, I'm singing. I sing from the same hymn sheet as you. I always say to clients, same as you probably. I say, look, there's going to be, you know, this is the continuum of possible pain of withdrawal. 90% of it can be managed, but there will be 5 to 10% of pain, and you just got to accept it's going to be there. And that's then we can think about how you might be able to manage that and sort of ameliorate it, but ultimately you're going to have to suck it up, you know. And I agree. I mean, and there are definitely people we've probably seen over the years who are just not really able, for whatever reason, to tolerate any kind of discomfort or pain, and therefore not willing to come off any kind of medication regime. And that's sad, I think, because I think recovery from addiction is possible for everyone, but to get it, you have to bite the bullet at some point and accept there's going to be some pain involved.
Now, again, I'm interested in your view. Whenever I tell people there's going to be pain, they obviously seem to think, in my opinion, that I'm withholding something from them. I'm withholding the thing that will take the pain away. So they get annoyed and angry, and they don't understand that I'm not hiding something under the sofa. It's just a reality. So that's the first point. The second thing I'm interested in your point of view, they often say, I'm going to feel really terrible. And you then ask them, well, what is it you think you're going to feel? And then they describe the most mildest of things that seem to panic them. And when you try to say, but what you just described isn't so terrible, again, they get really angry. And they kind of, do the classic, you don't understand my pain, doctor. But, again, what are your thoughts? Sometimes you're hearing people describe things that really aren't that bad. They're just terrified of the thing that isn't that bad. It's more the terror than the actual thing.
Well, that's right. I agree with everything you say. I mean, I worked for a few years in a primary rehab in Cape Town, and we did a lot of detoxes there. And yeah, I mean, it's you see again and again, it's the medication-seeking behavior of the clients, from the nurses wanting medication to manage, and a real intolerance for discomfort. And going back to your earlier point about rationality, it's quite hard rationally to understand, because actually it's not so bad. Actually, and also it passes. It's only for a few days or a couple of weeks. It's not, it's not forever. But I think when one's caught up in that addiction cycle, it just becomes, I suppose the thing is, people with an addiction problem they tend to use chemicals to manage things. One is always reaching for a chemical solution to whatever the problem might be. As you're probably aware in the literature, there's a lot of studies actually looking at heroin addicts' tolerance for pain, and it does seem to be lower than for normal people.
Yeah, but I want to go back to that chemical thing you just said about they're always looking for chemistry. There's the famous catchphrase advertising line for DuPont Chemicals, "Better living through chemistry," from the 1950s. But I've always amazed again, and again, I'm going to say something challenging and provocative. Many people have been through the system, have had lots of detoxes, been in lots of very expensive rehabs. And when I announced to them that one of their basic problems is they're looking for solutions in chemistry, and they're going to have to deal with a lot of life without chemistry, they give me a very funny look, like it's the first time they've heard that. And often it is the first time they've heard that. And that is the starting point of treatment of addictions. You are going to have to abandon chemistry. And all the things that you thought you needed chemistry for, millions of people around the world deal with tough stuff without chemistry and have through the millennia of human history. So I also think that this is, again, you're going to run screaming from the room when I say this, a lot of rehab, a lot of drug treatment is not very good because they don't bite the bullet and tell people what they need to hear as opposed to what they want to hear. Again, over to you. What are your thoughts?
I think that is a provocative statement, but I think it's true. I think it's true. I think the problem certainly I think in private sector treatment, and this would always have been the case, going right back probably to the 19th century, the tail can wag the dog. In other words, the financial tail can wag the therapeutic dog, and that means that you take a Valium detox. That shouldn't be really. I mean, maybe that's a bad example. To take a classic heroin detox, even someone on huge amounts of heroin who comes into treatment, you should be able to get that wrapped up within 10 days, probably. Like it's just finished, it's over. Certainly within 2 weeks. But there are a lot of places where people will leave treatment on day 28 and they only finish their detox the day before. And you see it especially actually with Valium. They leave treatment on day 28, still not detoxed from Valium, still taking Valium on a Valium script, albeit it might have come down. Why is that? I mean, perhaps it's because, people are, the service providers are not being sufficiently tough around just ending the detox regime, because the client doesn't want the detox to end, because, as we said, they don't want to tolerate pain. I suppose, however, there's still plenty of good places out there which will manage it. And perhaps it's about, the good places are better at managing ambivalence and complexity, and maybe have better quality nursing staff, better psychiatry, better therapists. But I agree, I think it's a problem.
So tell us a bit about your clinic. You founded a clinic. That's a rare privilege to talk to someone who's actually founded a clinic. Tell us a bit about it and what's different about it.
Stop. Well, we're based in London, in South Kensington, and we do most forms of addiction rehab except for primary rehab. So actually, we don't do detoxes, we don't do anything medical, and we don't have nursing. So we're a Care Quality Commission registered clinic, but what we specialize in is residential secondary care. So the clients we like to work with are people who, for whatever reason, have crashed and burnt and have gone somewhere, and it could be anywhere in the world. We work very internationally for primary treatment, which could be anything from 28 days to 3 months. And then they come back to London, and our proposition is come and live with us. We've got 22 beds and 6 houses in South Ken. Come and live with us, and we'll support you while you build a life in London in recovery. That's a residential proposition. And we then have a really excellent evening outpatient program, which I founded in 2010 and has been running continuously since then. And that's a 14-week program for a very different kind of client and for binge pattern addicts. So the thing about addiction is the stereotypical addict is someone, physically addicted to alcohol or heroin or whatever it might be. Those guys are probably only 35% of people who meet the criteria for addiction. Approximately 65% of people who meet the criteria are actually binge pattern. In other words, not physically dependent, don't need a detox, don't necessarily at all need to go to residential rehab. Even in their addiction cycle, they're staying clean or abstinent for days or sometimes weeks at a time, and are probably quite high functioning, holding it together with careers and relationships, and importantly, quite highly motivated. So those guys will do a 14-week evening program with me. And the proposition is live at home, go to work, and come to us in the evenings and on Saturdays. And we'll help you over 14 weeks, learn to be in recovery in the real world, build a recovery architecture, and set yourself up nicely for long-term, hopefully reasonably happy recovery. So that's what we do. So we have residential 22 beds for people who've done primary treatment and come to us. And then we have an evening outpatient program for quite a different sort of cohort.
But for you to go as far as founding a new clinic, you must have felt that the area needed a new approach. You must have been unhappy with the approach that everyone was getting elsewhere. So what was your unhappiness, and what was the new approach?
Another good question, Raj. Well, you see, I cut my teeth in South Africa, and I worked for a really brilliant guy called Roger Mayer, and Roger had a sort of very vertically integrated treatment system. There was primary, there was secondary, there was tertiary, there was outpatient. And I, in about 2008, got the opportunity to take over the outpatient program. And I remember when I took it over from the outgoing treatment head, sitting in with him on some assessments, and because he was sort of shepherding me into it. And, you know, I remember thinking, God, because my whole sort of paradigm was so like residential rehab focused. I couldn't really imagine people with addiction problems just living at home and coming in for a very part-time program actually doing well. So I was a bit cynical, but then I discovered quite quickly, actually, outpatient treatment for binge pattern addicts is an amazingly excellent modality. It's really cost effective and very therapeutically effective. You have really good outcomes. And I was aware that nothing like that. So I was aware that at that time in London, there was, you know, obviously residential rehabs, and then, but nothing else really, other than one-to-one therapy and one-to-one psychiatry. And because I was aware, I wrote for a private college in South Africa. I wrote there about 72 hours. It took a lot of work in my spare time, 72 hours of lectures, which I think is now part of a B-Psych. And by doing that, I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned epidemiologically was really 65% of people with an addiction problem with binge pattern. And I was aware that in London, that particular cohort didn't really have any options other than one-to-one therapy, which is probably not enough. But equally, those guys probably wouldn't be willing to go to residential rehab and were not really indicated for residential rehab. So I thought there was an opportunity. So basically, I came back in 2010 thinking there's an opportunity in the London market for an outpatient program for people with binge pattern, probably alcohol and coke problems.
But it is a private thing, so people have to some extent have some resources in order to pay for it. And often people are maybe a bit surprised that private treatment isn't as expensive as their fantasy, which is a barrier to them to think about it. But let's talk about the money, because the money is usually a problem with addicts. They usually have found a way to extract money from someone or somewhere in order to fund the addiction. Because unlike the rest of psychiatric disorder, you need money to pay for the stuff, right? And you mentioned you went to Edinburgh University and you've come from this very aristocratic, distinguished family. So I suspect, I'm just going out on a limb here, there was a bit of money in your background that may have explained partly the heroin thing. But so isn't part of the thing that has to happen is you've got to stop the money in some way? That usually means some kind of family therapy involvement, because often they're getting the money from some enabler or facilitator, not always, but often. So you can't just deal with the addict. You have to also speak to parents or whoever is funding the addiction and get them to stop doing that. And isn't that one of the great weaknesses of many programs? They just focus on the addict and they don't see the wider system the addict's in that holds them into the addiction.
I think, I mean, I think good quality providers have really strong family programs. I mean, to take Start My Rehab, we have every Wednesday night is a family support group on Zoom that family members can attend. In terms of in the building, we do conjoints, facilitated sit-down meetings with family members. So we involve family a lot. There are other places I can think of where families come in for even anything from 2 to 5 days of really intensive family work at some point during the course of treatment. But you're right, there's also plenty of places where family involvement is very loose, it's very pro forma. And you're spot on, families, addiction is a systemic problem, of course. And it's not just about treating the addict, it's very much about treating the family system. And it's all about creating accountability and boundaries and educating. And, if the addict is feeling, whatever the addict's feeling, the family are feeling, if the addict's feeling powerless, out of control, angry, family, spouse, parents, children are probably feeling exactly the same. And I think also for family often don't know what to do for the best. And so I think it's incredibly important, to have a family systems component to any treatment approach. And for anyone listening to this show, if you're thinking of going to treatment, or for a loved one going to treatment, really recommend, questions to ask a treatment center are, how do you approach the family? What kind of work do you do with families? How many hours a week? How many hours a month? Because that is key. Absolutely.
So we both know that addicts can be very manipulative. They can get on the phone and manipulate people and berate them and abuse them, and as a result, extract resources. So often when you do family work, you're trying to train family members to cope with that. But ultimately, sometimes, I'm interested in your opinion in this, they just are too vulnerable and they just can't cope with the manipulation. So I think sometimes you have to actually say to the family, you should cease communication until the addict's recovered. That pulling up the drawbridge and ceasing all communication is the only answer. If what's happening all the time is that you keep getting manipulated, even just being available so that the addict can download and vent, which causes distress to the family members, is also a problem, because the addicts are, excuse the analogy, a shark circling looking for a porthole. But if you remove contact, they give up on that sooner or later. But that I have experienced is seen as a rather extreme intervention, but I believe it's sometimes necessary. But again, I'm interested in your opinion on that.
I mean, Raj, I think you're highly experienced. I mean, I think what you're describing is often best practice. I've done 2 assessments in the last couple of years, precipitated by the parents calling the police each on the 2 occasions on their child who'd been haranguing and harassing one of the parents for money, and they just called the police. So that worked in the sense that created enough of a crisis to get the person into treatment. And the advice is always the same, which is love your child, or love your husband, or love your wife, but reject the addiction. Have boundaries with the addictive behavior, but carry on loving the person that's really there. I think it gets difficult when I think it's quite easy as a healthcare professional to give advice. I think it's very different if it's your child. I suppose there's the fear of death, of someone dying. And so families do struggle with boundaries. But I think on the whole, paradoxically, if you're unable to find boundaries, you're probably making it more likely that your loved one is going to die in the end.
But that's a terrible. Most people don't understand that point. That's a tough one.
That is a really tough one, but paradoxically, that's what's going to happen. And actually, tough love does work with addiction.
But the other reason why tough love works, sorry to interrupt you, is that it forces the addict to look more inwards at themselves as being the solution, as opposed to looking outwards to always someone else is going to bail them out.
Well, that's right, but it also starts to create some pain for the addict, because if in a way people probably recover from addiction when the pain of recovery is less than the pain of addiction. Both are sets of pain. In a way, you've got to think about which set of pain you want to have in your life. But if addiction needs to become sufficiently painful that recovery starts to look like a better option. And I think if one is endlessly enabled with families paying rent, giving allowances, financial support, whatever it might be, handouts, essentially you're just paying to perpetuate the addiction.
But don't we live in a crazy world now where if you give the advice and the parents pull up the drawbridge and the addict, let me take an extreme example, is wandering the streets, homeless and complaining that they're feeling suicidal. Maybe they are feeling suicidal, but it may also be a manipulative statement to try and get help. If you stick to your guns, the parents ring you up and say, look, he's messaged us again, we're very worried about him. And you stick with the advice and say, look, it's up to you. But my advice is the best thing at the moment, going back to what you just said, is the addiction's got to be more painful. And if anything then happens to that addict and you're in a coroner's court, right, you're going to be in trouble as a professional, because actually people outside the profession and the regulators don't understand that although something may have gone disastrously wrong with someone dying, that was still the correct advice. What are your thoughts about that point? And that fear of the regulator means that people don't give the correct advice, and they crack when the parents say he's messaged me yet again, because you can't, you're worried about ending up in a coroner's court.
Well, that's right. I mean, yeah, that's all very true. I suppose the answer is that the way it's about how the advice is given and its options. You know, it's you could do this, you know, or you could do that. But you're right. I mean, ultimately, one is always aware of the regulator, and of course the client safety. And I think for the parent, again, you know, if their loved one is walking the streets saying they're feeling suicidal, you need to give me 100 quid. It's one thing the therapist saying, well, don't give them the 100 quid, they're just going to buy some crack. But what if the parent holds to that advice, they don't give them the 100 quid, and the child then kills themselves? So I think I agree, it is difficult.
And I think that the regulator is a looming presence and doesn't seem interested in understanding sometimes the way in which they're being unhelpful, because actually ultimately that's not really helpful to the patient in the end. That the therapist ends up being very stressed and again ends up giving advice or not sticking to advice that they really agree with, because they're practicing defensive medicine or defensive psychology. And I think increasingly people are forced into a defensive position, and real treatment involves taking risk and embracing the risk and engaging with the risk. There is no treatment without risk in psychology and psychiatry, I think. But again, I'm interested in your opinion on that.
I mean, no, I think also very true. You know, the UK is very regulated, also becoming more litigious. I think it's noticeable, certainly with addictions treatment. I would say the boldest addictions treatment is probably done in places like South Africa, where it's where the sort of advice you were just talking about is given, and perhaps where, you know, people feel less constrained in how they work with clients. But I think in England, ultimately, you know, obviously client safety comes first, but I think you're right. I mean, if you look at the evolution of the addictions treatment field since it started really in the 70s in England, it's changed a lot. It used to be very freewheeling, almost unregulated, and it's just become probably more and more regulated, and as a consequence of that, safer. And not just safer in a sort of environmental sense of health and safety, but I think safer in the sense of how people practice, and probably more person-centered, which we haven't really touched on. But I think, you know, going back to the zeitgeist, you know, society as a whole, we're all subjectivity rules, right? Objectivity has been got rid of. It's all about subjectivity. And I think that filters down also to, I think, I'd say my experience of rehab, both as a client and as someone who delivers rehab, it's become much more client-led. Whereas it used to be more top-down. I think it's now much more bottom-up, client-led, with client subjectivity way more important than it used to be.
But that's not necessarily a good thing. That doesn't necessarily help people get better.
No, I mean, you know, when I started out nearly 20 years ago, you know, clients would be told things like, you know, take the cotton wool out of your what was it? Take the cotton wool out of your ears and stick it in your mouth, stuff like that. You know, it's sort of,
okay, well, that's too brutal.
Yeah, it was much more, but that was norm. You know, it was much more probably punishing, and that was probably harmful to a lot of people. I think it probably helped some people, but it's also very damaging to others.
But now maybe things are swung
the other
way. But I wanted to ask you, because we're running out of time a little bit, there's a sense in which now there's obviously training in psychology and psychiatry, there's qualifications, it's very regulated, but the reality is there's a secret ingredient, a secret X factor, which helps people get better. And it may be the therapist is inspiring. I like to use the word inspirational. And it's very difficult to train that, or even, you know, think about how you could inject being an inspirational person into a therapist. So people can do all the training. I know many professors at eminent hospitals, eminent professors who I wouldn't let loose near a patient. They may have published lots of papers, but they can't actually get anyone better. And first of all, getting people better is very, very difficult. People don't realize, I think, outside of it, exactly how difficult it is, what a low cure rate there is. So people don't want to talk about it, but basically because there's lots of institutions around, but do they really deliver that much cure? Or there's lots of warm bodies in a room appearing active. But I want to go back to the point, therefore, the secret X factor, which is being inspirational, being passionate. There's something about wisdom. All of this stuff can't be trained. I wanted you on the program because I believe you have it. But I think that it's very rare. And I think you could spot it in other therapists, but it's very, very rare. And I think the move to what's called manualized therapy, where you manualize therapy and train people to deliver it, has lost some element of that. But anyway, what are your thoughts about that point, that magic X factor? In the 60s, the research was empathy, genuineness, and warmth, E.G. and W, which was an attempt to capture the idea. But what are your thoughts?
Well, someone called Bill Miller, who's a big guy in the addictions field, he talked about confidence, competence, and what was it? Charisma. So those are the 3 C's that you needed to have to be an effective addictions counselor. I think clearly, on one level, there's been the industrialization really of therapy, and CBT lends itself to that because it's manualized and it's protocol driven and it's quite easy to measure outcomes, and that those outcomes, can be used to sort of motivate for more funding and so on and so forth. I think some of the other psychological approaches, especially, of course, famously psychoanalytic approaches, are much harder to measure. So I think that's all true. I mean, I think certainly what you see in the addictions treatment field is many people are like me. People have had their own addiction problems, so wounded helpers, if you like, and come into it. And I mean, in my case, I was basically unemployable when I woke up one day in rehab thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? When I was about 35. But yeah, all I can really say, Raj, is I agree. Again, I think, it is about the interpersonal element. That is the key ingredient probably. And have some people are able to, have what it takes and some don't.
And that X factor, we look out for it in other people and we refer our patients to them if we think they have it, but it is very, very rare. You slid past that point that I was trying to make. Do you agree it's very rare? I think it's very rare.
Yeah, I mean, yes. What can I say? I think it can be. Yeah.
Okay. So we're running out of time. I want to now take us back to the Titanic and, ironically, the notion of being rescued and lifeboats, and the fact that I thought was very interesting. You did try to rescue your ancestor. So first of all, a lot of psychology is involved in that, in my opinion. You didn't take the thing at face judgment. You looked into it yourself. You were suspicious as to the original story. How much of that motivation within you is part of what therapy is about? Don't take a proper history, be interested in the detail, don't accept the face story of what's happening, be sympathetic, be about the idea that people aren't just villains or heroes. There's more going on. How much of that do you think informs your practice?
Massively. Yeah, massively. It's very interesting actually hearing you sort of wrap it up like that. Hugely. I mean, certainly with addictions treatment, the thing about addicts is addicts have a whole system. As an unconscious mechanism, but not, you could say also as an acronym that stands for "Don't even know I am lying." And so the narrative that addict comes out with is and actually this is a really important distinction between addiction counseling and normal psychotherapy. Psychotherapists would be person-led, person-centered, and client-led, and probably will take at face value what the client tells them. An experienced addictions counselor will hear the narrative, but interpret it through the prism of the client's denial, and then be very forensic. So actually, for me, good addictions treatment is all about being forensic and drilling into the detail, obtaining background collateral, third-party info from families, significant others, and in a way, what you're trying to do is deconstruct the narrative, deconstruct the denial, and help the client see the addiction. Because the irony about addiction is everyone knows the addict's an addict except the addict, because the addict has got 1,000,001 excuses. So it's kind of like Lemony Snicket, series of unfortunate events. And you're trying to show that rather than it being a series of unfortunate events, which is a function of the environment, the problem lies within, and it's a function of something to do with the person. And to be able to do that, you've got to deconstruct denial. So yeah, I think it's key.
And the art of this deconstruction, which is another catchphrase, is the client is lying until proven otherwise, which is what lawyers certainly believe about their clients, and addiction therapists often believe about theirs, is you have to be skeptical but still sympathetic. There's this really interesting balance or contradiction at the heart of all therapy. You have to be helpful but firm. Tell people stuff they don't want to hear, but they need to hear, but you're on their side. And there's an art to all of that, I think, which is very difficult to capture in training.
I think that's right. I think as with so many things, whatever really you're doing in life, experience is key. I think what helps with denial anyway is helping clients see that denial is really normal. It goes with addiction, and it's really an adaptation whose function is to perpetuate the addiction. And I think as clients start to become more conscious of that, I mean, also for me, a good sign that someone's getting well is when they say something, but catch themselves saying what they're saying and start laughing at their denial. You know, when they have insight, their internal spectator can spot the denial and start laughing at it. You know, and there's lots of different types of denial as well, which we haven't got time to go into here, but it's a fascinating area.
Right. So just to wrap up, the name of the clinic is Start to Stop. It's still running, and Cosmo is still involved in it. And thank you very much, Cosmo. And many thanks for telling us a story of your very illustrious, if somewhat notorious, ancestor who was in lifeboat number 1. And congratulations on the fact that you have created a kind of lifeboat for so many people and saved so many people over the years. Thank you very much for joining us.
Raj, thank you very much for having me.